I'm joined today by fellow Argentinian Federico Finchelstein, who's a professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and the author of 5 books about, among other topics, fascism, populism. His newest book is called The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War. It's so great to have you on, and I'm thrilled to talk about this idea of populism. We hear about populism when we hear about the ideas of presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. We sometimes hear about populism when we talk about, for example, the late Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, or the now former president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner. And you have analyzed and studied populism extensively. And not all populism is created equal, is it? Populism can be both progressive or conservative, left-wing and right-wing in many ways. Let's start there.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Well, populism has a lot of connections and also disconnections or important distinctions with fascism. But like fascism, populism is neither left or right, but rather a combination of both tendencies. I mean, the point is that in populism, what you have is an idea of a leader which always appears as a messianic one, as one with all the answers, as one that will basically provide a break with history. And that leader, one way or the other, states that he or she represents the people. That is to say that there is a straight, direct link between the people and the leader. So, I mean, whether that is a left or right argument, it's a matter of the contents of that particular style of politics. But the idea that there are no mediations between what the leader knows and what the leader wants, and what the people know and what the people want, I mean, it's a very strong one. And it basically characterizes both fascism and populism, populism on the right and populism on the left.
So I would love to have you talk about some of the differences that we have seen, maybe looking at some specific examples between a left-wing populist leader and a right-wing populist leader. You know, I get many emails from people who describe themselves, consider themselves progressive, who say, I love the ideas of someone like Bernie Sanders, and to me they seem similar to the ideas of someone like the former Venezuelan leader Chavez. Is that a fair analogy or comparison because they are both so-called populists?
No, I don't agree with that analogy at all. I think there are important, significant distinctions between Sanders and Chavez. Chavez was a populist leader. Sanders is not. I mean, there is a tendency in this country to equate a progressive position with a populist one, and there are important distinctions. The most important one, perhaps, is that populism implies an authoritarian understanding of politics, because this idea that there is a person, a leader, who is not just a guy, but the one who knows better than the rest what everybody wants. I mean, it's simply put authoritarian, and whether that idea serves anti-equalitarian politics or equalitarian ones, that idea is defined by its authoritarianism. Now, that is extremely different from the position of Sanders. So I actually do not think that there is an analogy, but rather the opposite, that these two politicians are antithetical.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? In other words, Bernie Sanders, he has this label in the United States as the populist candidate in the sense that he is for the people as opposed to for the elites. And that's a common characteristic of populists, right? That they are anti-elites, however you define the elites in a particular context. Can you talk a little bit more about what specifically about Bernie Sanders' ideas do not strike you as populist?
Well, I'm not an expert in either Mr. Sanders or American politics as such, but I will say that I mean, when you let's say when you listen to Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or even other Democratic candidates, you don't find these statements or these ideas, which eventually, when they are in government, turn into policies. These ideas that the leader is the only one that knows, that the leader basically anticipate what the people want, or rather, or even that the leader knows better than the people. So you have the opposite. You have an idea of dialogue. You have an idea of reaching out, and also you have an idea of the people. And this is very important. I mean, this is perhaps a major distinction. You have an idea of the people which is very diverse. On the other hand, in opposition to this very diverse idea of the people, in populism, what you have is what a French political thinker Claude Lefort called a unitary notion of the people, a unitarian notion of the people. That is to say that the people are very homogeneous, that the people always resemble the looks and the thinking of the leader. So that's very different. And in populism, what you have is this. In populism of the right, now going back to your question of what is the difference between populism on the left and populism on the right. Let's say the difference between Mr. Trump and Mr. Chavez, or let's say Marine Le Pen and I will say Christina Kirchner. I mean, Trump and Le Pen representing the populist right, and Kirchner and Chavez representing the populist left. I mean, there are important differences between all these understandings of the political. One is that both share, because they are populists, both share an idea of the enemy that is central to the political. That is to say, that you cannot do politics without having an actual enemy. But there are important distinctions. In populism on the left, what you have is the enemy is generally represented as a citizen of the nation who is a traitor to the nation. Whereas in populism of the right, generally the enemies are internal and external minorities. For example, immigrants, or let's say religions which are different to whatever they believe the people are. So if Mr. Trump believes that Americans are, especially or particularly white and Christian, then the enemy for him becomes Muslim and Hispanic. And this is not really an example. This is basically what defines his idea of the political enemy in the US.
Can you talk a little bit about something you said at the beginning, which is when we talk about populism, it's also important to understand how so-called populist ideas can sometimes lend themselves in the direction of either fascism or totalitarianism. I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Well, historically, I would say historically is the other way around. I mean, basically what you have is fascism, which after 1945 couldn't be. I mean, it couldn't be a legitimate political choice in Europe or Latin America or the US. And you have people coming from that tradition, that very authoritarian tradition, creating first a populism of the right, a populism, let's say, a form of democratic politics, which was still anchored in fascism. Now, fascism is not democratic at all. Fascism is basically stands and advocates for dictatorship. After 45, the fascists or people close to fascism couldn't do this dictatorial and totalitarian politics in the new democracies that emerged, so they created an in-between, something that was and looked democratic, but also was rooted in authoritarian traditions. So if Mussolini or Hitler advocated for dictatorship, what people like Chavez or Trump will be advocating for will be authoritarian democracies. And there is a major distinction between fascism and populism on one hand, but on the other hand, they are quite connected. They both share an idea of politics with, let's say, messianic leaders, with establishing no mediations between, at least metaphorically, between the leader and the people. That is to say that there is a strong anti-institutional tradition in both fascism and populism.
So is it fair to say, at least, that in some cases we've seen right-wing populism actually be the sort of public face of what were unpalatable or no longer practical fascist ideas? Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, it's an important repackaging, but a repackaging that in a way changes also the substance of the thing. Because what you have is a form of authoritarian democracy, which eventually turns to be a very different thing to a form of dictatorship. I mean, that is to say that, the fascists use elections to destroy the democratic system. The populists use elections to win elections, and when they win, they call for new elections whenever it happens, because they resort to, let's say, that form of electoral legitimacy. So but then there are not, let's say, it's not that the boundaries are totally eliminated between fascism and populism. That
There's
is
a
to
sort
say,
of spectrum, right?
it's a spectrum. So what you are seeing in Venezuela now is perhaps the possibility, if they decide to go that way, that even they will no longer. I mean, I'm talking about the current populist leader in Venezuela, Maduro. They didn't have good electoral results. They are losing Congress. Now the question is whether they will remain in a populist fashion, that is to say, respecting the electoral system, or they will go in a more dictatorial way. Because I mean, populism is a form of democracy that doesn't rely too much on institutions, but still relies on elections. So when you don't have elections, when you don't have that sort of key element of democracy, not the only one, but a key element of democracy, then you no longer have populism, but perhaps you have fascism or totalitarianism.
Well, we will continue following the situation in Venezuela as we have. I want to thank our guest today, Federico Finchelstein, professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York City. His newest book is called The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.